I want to spend most of the session going through a coding exercise. Does that sound good? Do you guys want to look at some Apple code, some iOS code? Cool. In the start, we'll kind of talk about why mobile. We'll do a little walkthrough, and we'll finally get into building an iOS app. Does anyone have Xcode installed on their computers? Okay. So if you want, you can follow along when we get to that point. So many people are developing mobile these days as opposed to traditional desktop applications. Have you seen that happen? So more and more people are moving towards using the mobile phones compared to a desktop computer, right? The emphasis has been shifting towards using tablets and mobile phones. This is a graph from quite a while back. This shows how much mobile has grown compared to desktop apps, which have kind of flatlined, and this is tablet right here, which is still catching up. So more and more, we do our payments on PayPal with our mobile phone. We talk to people with what do you use to chat? So WhatsApp. People aren't using the traditional Yahoo messengers anymore. People are moving towards WhatsApps and Telegrams, and these are all mobile applications. So what's great about mobiles is today, your cell phone has more computing power than a computer 10 days or 10 years ago had, correct? So there's so much computing power in your mobile phone, and they're everywhere. You don't need a big bulky computer to carry around to use an app. So that's one of the big reasons why mobile is catching along so quickly. Feel free to stop me and ask questions if you have any questions. Right? These are conversion rates by device. I'm not going to bore you with this slide. Okay, there's new device categories within the iOS framework. Have you guys used a smartwatch? Any smartwatch, Apple Watch or Android Watch? Looks like we have some. So the good part with an Apple Watch is it uses the same software framework as an iPhone and a tablet. So you can use the same programming languages to develop for a watch and as you do for a mobile phone. Does anybody know what are iOS languages? What languages do you use to code for iOS? Looks like we have, okay.
They use like Python. Oh.
I know somebody here has developed an iOS. So can you tell us what languages we use for iOS? Or looks like we have somebody here.
Objective-C and Swift.
Right, so you know what is more easier than the other?
Swift is easier than Objective-C.
Why do you think so?
The coding is pretty straightforward compared to Objective-C.
Okay, what's your name?
Mustafa.
Thanks for helping out, Mustafa. You just stole the next two slides that I had. But pretty much, what happens with programming is the newer a language is, the more user-friendly it will be and the more easier it is to code in. So there's Objective-C and there's Swift, and these are based on C and C++. Have people here programmed in C and C++? Is it pretty easy to write in C? No, it's not. But it's much more easier to write programs in Swift, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So the advantages of Swift, before we get into actual coding, this is some groundwork that we'll set. Swift is safer. What that means is, does anybody know what is safe code? Has anyone used Java? Have you seen null pointer exceptions? So safe code is code which doesn't crash as often as code like Java does. So it prevents from crashing by setting up rules in the start which make it hard to crash later on as the program runs. So Swift has a big emphasis on safety, and it's faster, richer, meaning it's more modern, and it has like many more like programming paradigms that you can use much easily. What's the disadvantages of Swift? Do you know how old Swift is? How long has it been around? Year and a half. So Swift was released in 2014 at the WWDC, which is Apple's conference. So it's very new, and the adoption has not been that high. And you still need to know a bit of Objective-C, which is based on C. Let's talk about mobile categories here for a second. Has anyone heard about what is a design pattern in software? Sorry? So what do you mean by a design pattern? Graphics. Okay, that's a graphics could be a design pattern, but things like singleton patterns. Does anybody know what a singleton pattern is? Or okay, what that means is how you're going to write your code. You can divide it into blocks. So when you write your code, you don't do the whole thing at once, but you divide it into modules and develop one module at a time. Does that sound good? So you work on one thing at a time. That's what modular programming is all about. And in mobile, it's called the MVC pattern. Has anyone heard about MVC? So it's, you know what? Can everyone hear me without the mic? Okay, so MVC is model. You know what? Let me try reducing the volume a little. I think you have to stay away from that side. So MVC is model, view, and controller, and we'll talk about this briefly. So model is all about your data, where your data lives. Like you have your web application which shows you the grades of students, for instance. So what is the model in that? Can you tell me what's the model in an app which shows you grades? So the grades itself, like the data which is in the app, it's called the model. And then we have the view. The view is what you actually see, right? The GUI, the interface that you see, is called a view. And finally, we have a controller. So a controller is the glue between models and views. So the view is something that you interact with, the screens that you see, and the model is the data that is shown in the screen. And the controller controls the relationships between the model and the view. Does that make sense? So mobile programming is all about MVC. You have your models, you have your views, and you have your controller. And the way it works is every screen is a view. Every screen that you have in an app is a view. The way you develop mobile apps is you develop one screen at a time. There could be like 20 or 30 screens in your app. If you have Facebook, you have your login screen, you have your friend screen. But the way a developer develops this is one screen at a time, or one view at a time. And then there's a controller which goes with every view. And then there's services. These are extensions. I'm not going to bore you with this again. Frameworks. So frameworks are things like hardware, graphics, network. Do you know what persistence is? Does anybody know what is persistence? So persistence is how we store data. For instance, you log into an app and you save your name and your location, and then you log in once more. It has to pull what you saved in the first time, right? That's called persisting data. So that's what's persistence. So this is Xcode. Before we get into programming, do we have any questions? Any questions? Okay, so let's go ahead and start up Xcode and make a simple app. I'm going to do a programming demo, and feel free to ask me questions as we go along. Does that sound good? Do you guys want to see a programming demo with Xcode making an iPhone app? Does that sound good? Okay. I don't know how to put it so it doesn't. Does anybody have any ideas? Yeah, what's your idea?
Turn it off temporarily.
What?
Turn it off temporarily.
Not temporarily, but it looks like people in the back cannot hear me. So put it on the floor. Let's see if that works. I don't know if it's making it any better. Let me try using like a water bottle to prop it up. Can you hear me, guys? Okay, so let's try that. Let's start off Xcode. So Xcode is the IDE. Do people here know what an IDE is? What is an IDE? Internet Development Environment. Does anybody else want to take a guess? What is an IDE? Yeah, that's pretty close. Integrated Development Environment. So what an IDE does is how it helps you is you can do your testing, your coding, and your deployment all in one program. So that's what an IDE is. What do you guys use to code? Do you use like Sublime Text or
WebStorm.
WebStorm? What language do you code in?
JavaScript.
Okay. Have you guys heard of IntelliJ or Eclipse? Okay, so you probably use Eclipse for Java. Here's a tip: if you're developing Cry using IntelliJ, they have a really good community version, which is free. And if you're a student, they give you the ultimate version of IntelliJ for free. It's a really good IDE. You can use it for Java, Python, PHP, or any language. So if you're developing Cry using IntelliJ. So Xcode is the IDE for all of Apple's development. So let's start with a new project. So what we'll build is we'll build a single one-page app which will help you calculate the tip amount. So if you have a bill, we'll create a control. You can select 15% or 18% or 20% tip, and it will give you the sum total and your bill amount, all in a graphical user interface. Does that sound okay? Good deal. And I haven't really talked about Swift, but as we code, we'll talk about the different syntax and the different things that you need for iOS development. So let's get right to it. And guys, feel free to stop me anytime and ask me questions. Yes. Yeah. So Xcode is free for anybody who has a Mac, and I was hoping people would see like the page we had about the requirements, and Xcode is free. You can definitely download Xcode. And if you have registered for this event, there's a bunch of resources where you can learn about Swift and Xcode. And I'll make sure we send out an email, and I'll also send you a recording of the session. Okay? So Xcode. Once you start Xcode, you would start with a new project, and you'd start with a single view application. Even though your application might have many views, you always start with a single view application. So I love simple decision trees like that. There's only one option, single view application, unless you're doing games. So let's select next. What do we call our app? Any ideas? It's going to calculate tips. So here's where I need to put your creative hats on. Okay. Can you talk louder, or here, talk into this mic? A tip calculator, that sounds good. Anyone else? Can you talk louder? Shout it out. I forgot. Okay. How about Tipster? Does Tipster sound good? Because you want to come up with a catchy name. Okay, for now, let's go with Tipster. I'm going to call it Tipster. If anybody's following along, looks like Aisha here is. Are you kind of try and follow a little bit? Okay, cool. So you got to start with a single view application, and we'll call it Tipster. And we'll select Swift because, as we just talked about, Swift is like way more easier to use than Objective-C is. Let's go next. Sorry? Select like iPhone. I mean, you can develop apps for, I think they have Watch and iPhone and iPad. But let's just go with iPhone here. Let's go next. Can you guys see my screen, or does it need to be bigger? It needs to be bigger? Okay. Is this better? Does it look a little better? Okay. Okay. I'll get to it in a second. So let's just save it on the desktop. Say create. So welcome to Xcode. It's an IDE, like I said. It has three main components. If you can see on the left side, here we have what's called your navigation area. It shows you like the different areas of where you can of your files. It shows you the different files that you can navigate between. And this area is your editor. And here are all the utilities. And here you can select what orientation your app will work in. For now, let's just go ahead with portrait and deselect the others. Okay. Let's go and look at main storyboard. So main storyboard is the entry point of your application. So when somebody starts using your application, this is the first thing that they will see. Now, I don't like this funky look here. It doesn't look like a phone. It does look like phone. So I think Apple here is trying to give us like what devices in future will look like. Maybe they'll look like squares. But we can turn it back to look like a phone. So in the utility area, these are different things that you can click on. Here is called the file inspector. Let's go ahead and click on that. I know it would have been easier if people had their laptops, but is this interesting or is it kind of boring, or what do you guys say? What I'll do is like I'll send you all a session of what we did, like a recording, the screen recording, and you can go home and try it out if you can't follow along right now. Yeah? Okay, cool. So you disable auto layout and disable size classes. What auto layout does is if anybody has done web programming, you can select offset from like the endpoint, like the edges or the margin or padding, things like that, right? So when you disable auto layout, it will make it fixed to your phone and it won't lay it out automatically. So let's do that. And all right, that's your screen. Let's start by dragging and dropping elements to here. So the way an iOS app works is very similar to a web application. It's very, very similar. You drag and drop static elements and then you update them dynamically, right? Like in a web app, you have like a name, which is a static field, and then you fill it with data dynamically. So the iOS app is like very, very similar to that. So let's go ahead and search for what's called as a label. In CSS, it would be like a div, which is a very generic element. So you can drag and drop a label here. Let's call it bill amount. You can drag and drop it to move it. In iOS, you can do an option drag, which will copy that element. So when we do the recording, it'll also capture like mouse clicks and keystrokes, so you can follow along when you go home. So let's call it tip. Let's move it over here. So I'm going to do an option click once more. Just make sure it lines up. So we are going to put a bill amount, we're going to put a tip and a total amount. Let's put some generic numbers here. Are you having trouble? What's going on?
It won't copy.
Sorry, what?
It won't copy.
Are you doing an option drag?
Yeah.
Do you guys mind if I take a look at her computer really quick?
I got it.
You got it?
No, wait, it's disappeared.
Okay, you know what? Let's talk afterwards. So let's make this a little bigger. There's an inspector here, right here with the ruler. That's this one, the crosshair. That's an inspector, and you can make your element bigger. So we'll just design this first, and then we'll connect it in code. So I want this to be, say, 25. And just make this a little bigger. Let's make that bold too. And just like you do in your web development, you can make it aligned. So I'm going to make this left aligned. And make this right justified. You can put in a separator here. A separator in iOS is like a generic view. So also right here in your navigator, you can search for different elements. So I'm searching for a view here. I'm going to drag and drop a view. I don't know why it's acting like that. Let's give it a color because you can't see with a white background. So let's make it like a dark gray color. And you would also need something for an input here. So we'll take the input from the user, right? The input in iOS, I think it's called, let's try input. What is it? Text? A text field, okay, great. So let's get a text field here. Make it bigger. And let's just write justified. So this is like a skeleton that we've built, and we want to see how it looks like. We can run it with a command R. So let's go ahead and run that. See how it looks. Or you can click this play button right here. And I don't want an iPhone 6 Plus, it might look too big. You can even connect your iPhone and play your app directly on your phone, but let's just use a simulator. Have you guys used a simulator for an Android? And so with Android, it has an emulator which acts like a real phone, but with iOS, it's kind of built on top of OS X. So it's not going to look exactly like your iPhone, but it gives you a pretty good picture. Before you release your app, make sure you test it on a real phone before you just get it out there, right? So let's close the simulator and play. So this is what we've done so far. It's like very, very plain looking, but we can focus on making it look good once we add some functionality to it. So how about we make the tip and the amount change when we add something? Right now it shows a static thing. So let's go ahead and change that. So in Xcode you can collapse things. If you click this, the side is going to go away, and if you click this, the right side is going to close, and it'll give you more area to code in. And these rings, these are called like, well, I don't know what you call assistant editor. This is like the rings of power. Once you click this, it's going to show you code which corresponds to the screen. So the way iOS is laid out is every screen has code corresponding to it. Remember we talked about controllers and views. So on your left-hand side, you have your view and you have your controller. So every view has a controller associated with it. Okay, so I want the tip to change and I want the amount to change. So I need to somehow connect the static tip to something dynamic in code, right? The way you do that is you control and drop it. So when you control and drop, is it going to be an outlet? So it's going to show something when it's going to be an outlet, because it's not something which we take as input, but it's something that we are going to output, right? So it's going to be an outlet, and it's going to be a label. It's good practice to call your elements the type that they are of. So we can call it tip label. Let's call that tip label. And iOS will create one for you. It shows you a little circle here. If you hover over the circle, it will show you what element that is. So let's do the same with the total amount. Let's do the same with this. Can you talk louder? Oh, the pre-written. Okay, good question. So, like, it's a lot of boilerplate code, meaning it's a setup code that Xcode does it automatically for you when you do an iPhone app, so you don't need to worry about it. And we'll talk about view did load in a second. So this is code that comes when you create a new project. You don't have to do anything for it. Okay?
We have to drag the names in series.
No, you can drag it in whatever order you want them to be. But it's like good practice to call them what they're a type of, meaning there was a tip, so we call and it was a label, so we call it tip label in the end. So it'll be easy to reference later. Okay, so we have a total. What would be a good name? We can call it total label because it's a label type. So I'm going to call it total label. So let's connect that as well. View did load. So here is where I'm going to talk a little bit about what iOS programming is all about. It's all about input and output, any kind of programming. And input is things like gestures, and when you pan a screen, when you edit, when you put in a user input. So these are called events in iOS. We call them an event. So iOS programming is all about responding to events. And one of the events is view did load. What that means is when you first fire up an application, it calls this function. So it calls this function called view did load. So a view has loaded and do something. That's what we are saying. So when you start your application, that's the first thing which is going to run. Sound good? Okay. So what we'll do here is now we have it like 100 and 0. So let's change that. So let's call that tip label.text. What this refers to is the text that the tip label is referring to. So we can call it, say, $10. And we have a total amount, right? Total label.text. Let's just call it $50. We're just going to make sure that our code actually changes something at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this play button. So it shows $50, the 10 is kind of cut off, we can fix it, but this tells you that like our code is actually doing something. Let's make this bigger. So it looks better than what it's currently looking.
Anybody who's here for the coding with your favorite characters workshop is starting right now. If you guys are interested, it's for kids, 6 to 11 years old. So you guys can come to lecture number 1. Otherwise, continue here.
Cool, sound good. Let's continue. So what we want to do now is take the user input. Now we've statically assigned some values, but that's pretty boring, right? We want to be able to respond to a user input. So the user is going to enter an input here in this field, like the input field. So we got to collect what the user is entering. So we can do the command drop once more, or the control drop. You can see that it's called a text field. So I'm going to call it bill field. Like I said, it's good practice to call your elements what they're types of. So we'll call this bill field. And you want to take an action every time that field changes. Like I just said, iOS is all about responding to an event. When you add a new input, it's an event. It's like that thing changed. So we can, just like we did a control drop to call the element, we can do a control drag to create an action. Sorry? No. So we are going to call it not an outlet, but an action. Okay? And we are going to call it editing changed. What editing changed means is that that number there changed. So whenever the number changes, we want to change the tip and we want to change the amount, right? You guys can come closer if you want. No, you guys can come. And you got to name the function. So I'm going to call it editing changed. So what do we want to happen when the number changes? When somebody enters a number here, like we so we can enter a number here. You can see that the keyboard is showing like tip is usually not a text, it's usually a number, right? We can change that. But when you enter a number, you want your tip and your tip amount to change, right? So let's go ahead and hook that up here. And this is the initial part. So when our application loads, we want like both the tip and the total to be $0. Let's start with that. And when something has changed, we want it to reflect. So we got to get the bill amount. So here's where I'll talk a little bit about Swift. In Swift, before you create any variable, you have to use the keyword let or var. Let is a constant, meaning that it doesn't change, and var is a variable which can change. So bill amount is going to be input only once, though it changes every time the user enters it. But for our program, it's going to be fixed for now. So I'm going to use the keyword let to do that. Okay? So I'm going to use let bill amount. So I want it to be bill field dot text. So what I'm essentially doing here is getting the input that the user has entered in the bill amount and calling it bill amount. But it looks like it's complaining. Okay, so this is a good thing about Xcode, that it gives you warnings and errors here. This exclamation sign is a warning. It's not an error yet, so we can continue. And this is going to be a text, but is a number a text? Not really, right? Like you want it to be an integer or a floating point number, but not text. So we can put double in front of it. So bill amount is going to be a number. It's complaining about something. Okay. So when you see like these big dots here, it means there's an error and your program won't continue till you fix it. And it says it's an optional. Okay. Optionals is something which is also Swift terminology. Optional means that a variable can have a value or it can have a value of nil. Meaning if the user doesn't enter anything, it's going to be a nil, is what the iOS considers it to be. So we can fix it by putting an exclamation mark. So don't worry about it. I mean, you just go with it, put an exclamation point. And then we want our tip label, or let's do tip amount. So I'm going to create another variable called tip amount is equal to bill amount. Let's hard code this in for now. For now, we are just going to say like 20% tip. We'll put a radio button, we'll put a segment control later to select. So we're going to do that. I guess I'm going to have to compete with that cartoon thing right now. Again, it's complaining about an optional. So you can just click here and just hit enter and fix that. So you have a bill amount and you have a tip amount. And let's also calculate total. So you guys know if you have a bill and if you have a tip, the total will be like one plus the other, right? So we're going to do total amount is equal to bill amount plus tip amount. And what we can do now is we want your total amount to be that. Again, it's complaining about the optionals. Let's put a exclamation and make it happy. And let's go bill field or total label. So this right here is your total label, and we're going to change that. Total label dot text is equal to. So if it's a text, you have to use quotes. So dollar and total amount. So this funky syntax here, this backslash and square brackets, that's because we are using a variable substitution. So we don't want it to show tip amount, but we want it to show what tip amount stands for. And let's fix one more thing here. You see how we had like a alphanumeric keyboard instead of a decimal keyboard? So the way to fix that is you go here to your crossbars. There's this keyboard type here that you can select. Let's select number pad instead of like the default. So when you run it, it's going to show you. Hopefully, it's going to show you a number pad. Oh, okay, cool. It's showing a number pad. So let's enter something. Oh, okay. Looks like my tip total is changing, but my tip is not changing. So I missed something obviously. Just like we have the total label.text, we also have to line up the tip label.text. So let's do that right now. I'm going to call it tip label.text. Oops. Or tip. So let's go ahead and run that. Sound good? Yeah? So I do 12. See, that's changing. That's pretty good, right? And instead of it being hard-coded, let's now put in a control here where we can change the percentage of tip that we want to do. Do we have any questions at this point? Okay, you have any questions?
No, I just lost.
Okay, but can you follow along at least? I mean, not do it on your computer, but kind of follow along what we're doing, yeah? Okay, cool. So let's close this out, and you can close this too. You guys know radio buttons in web development, right? In iOS, there's no concept of a radio button, but we have what's called as a segmented control. It's the same thing. So let's get a segmented control element here and drag and drop it. Even if it's a radio button, you can only have 2 fields, and you can have more options per second or whatnot. Let's make it have 3 segments, and let's call it 15%. Let's call this 18%, and let's call this 20%. So this is going to be how much tip we give, and we should be able to select this and have it change. And one more thing I want to show you about our app so far that we've built is it's working well up to now. But what happens if you make this go away? Oops. Looks like it's crashing. Optionally found nil value. You expect the apps that you get from the App Store to crash? No, crashing is not good, right? So what it's complaining about is if there's no field entered, it's trying to multiply nil by 0.2 and it just crashes. So I'm sure you engineers out here know about if statements. Yeah? So what we'll do is we'll convert this into a variable instead of a constant. And if bill amount is nil, make it 0. So if we do that, what happens is when people don't enter something, it becomes a 0 instead of a nil. And your app will still work. So let's do that. And we had our segmented controller. You can use Command-Shift-O to quickly search for things, like I'm searching for main storyboard here. And like I said, it's all about inputs and outputs. So we need to give an input to our segmented control so we can do something in the code with it. So I'm going to drag and drop this here. And I'll call it tip control or tip control, whatever. Tip control. Like I said before, you see all these like circles here. If you just hover over them, it will show you like what element it's pointing to. And one more cool thing is here, if you go to the view controller is nothing but your screen. if you go to view controller and on your utility area, if you go to the right side, it shows you all the connectors. It will show you what everything is connected to, like actions and all the static labels as well. And also, one thing that I don't like about our app is that like if I enter something and if I click somewhere else, the keyboard doesn't go away. Wouldn't it be nice if the keyboard goes away, right? Like you want your thing to show up clean and you don't want this like annoying keyboard here. So we'll introduce another concept about gestures at this point, where a gesture could be like a tap gesture or a pan gesture or a zoom or a pinch. So these are called gesture recognizers in iOS. And what we want is if you click anywhere on the keyboard, you want your, or anywhere on the screen except your keyboard, you want your keyboard to go away. So let's search for a gesture. In Xcode, you can make things go away by clicking like all these things here. Just make your right side go away, and make it so you can have more real estate to work with. So let's search for a gesture. These are the basic gesture types. Can you guys see? There's tap recognizer gesture, the pinch gesture. These are all the basic gestures, and every gesture is a combination of these gestures. So let's use the tap gesture, and we want it to activate anywhere on the screen. So if I just drag and drop it on the screen, it will apply to the whole screen. And you see here on the top, this is kind of like your navigation area for your screen. This shows you that there's a tap gesture recognizer. But we need to tie an action to it. When people click something, it's not going to know what to do unless you tie an action to it. So let's click on this rings once more. And so when you drag and drop it to the top, you're declaring variables. And when you drag and drop it to the body, you're declaring actions about it. So let's take this tab gesture recognizer and do a control drag here. And it's going to be an action. And we want it to be a tap gesture recognizer. I'm just going to call it on tap, something really simple. So your main screen is called a view. And also one really good part about IDE and integrated development environment is it gives you code completion. Like iOS has like really, really long syntax names, and nobody will remember all these. So with Xcode, you can just type the first letter and it'll complete it for you. So view dot, let's do end editing. What end editing means is like take the keyboard away, and it wants a boolean. So we'll say true. True. Let's try that out, see if that works. So I'm just going to click outside. There you go, keyboard's gone. It's pretty good, right? So let's move on to, but when I'm changing my segmented control, nothing is changing. Okay, let's make sure it works. Here you can close these things away to give you more space, like I said. This is the debug area. So you can, if you hit this, that goes away. And if you hit this side, oh, actually, you can close this out and select your view controller. Actually, I like it better with both. So what we need to do now is make sure that when this changes, our tip amount and our total amount changes too. And we have a variable for it. Do you guys know what arrays are? What's an array or a list? It's a group of elements, right? And let's create a variable called tip percentages. So if it's 15, it's going to be 0.15, right? If it's 18, it's going to be 0.18. And if it is 20%, it's going to be 0.2. Like right now, we have it hard-coded to be 20%, but we want to change that, right? So the percentages, but we want an actual tip percent. Like what is the amount that we want to use? So let's do tip percentage is equal to tip percentage. And you have to give a suffix here. What that means is this is the 0th element, the first element, or the second element, and we want to tie it to our control. So the way that would work is, what did we call our control? We called it tip control. So we can call it tip control dot selected segment index. So what that means is like either 0, 1, or second element of this array. Right? Cool. So instead of multiplying it by 0.2, we can multiply it by the tip percentage. Let's run that and see if that works. Do you think it will work? Let me ask you, do you think it's going to work? Why do you think so? Let's see if it works. How many people think it's going to work? You think it's going to work? You think it's going to work? How many of you think it's not going to work? Okay, you think. Okay, did we connect an action to that event so far? Did we connect an action to changing the tip percentage? We didn't connect an action, so I don't think it's going to change, but let's try it. So let's go with 100. So far so good, 115%, but with 18%, it's not changing. So we need to tie an action to that event. Like I said, iOS is all about tying actions to an event, and the event could be, here we have editing changed. The event could be tapping something, where we had a tap and then we made the keyboard go away. So here, the event is going to be changing the segment here. So let's go ahead and do that. There's a complicated way to do it, and there's an easy way to do it. Which way do you guys want to do it? You want to do it the easy way? Okay. The easy way to do it is you just drop it to the function. So this is the function which is editing changed. You can control and drop it here, and it will tie this action to this event. And you can make sure it does by going to this connector here. You see let's select this tip control. Or here, let's just hover here. If we hover at this function here, it will show you what's controlling it. So the bill field and also the tip field is controlling it. Right? So let's go ahead and run that. Hopefully it'll work this time. So 120, 15%, and if you select the others, that works too. So that's a very, very basic app here, and we can make it even more fancy by adding a settings view. So when you create a settings view, you'll create a new page. Like we did the first page here, we'll create a new page, and we'll add a button for settings, and we'll tie that button to go to the next section. So any questions at this point? I mean, I'm going to talk a little more, but at this point I want to take questions that you have, or just give me your thoughts. Does iOS sound easy, or not easy? Why not?
Just probably because I'm not doing it because I was trying so hard to do something else that I realized.
Oh, okay. You know, I'm going to send everybody a video so you can try it at home. And if you think iOS is hard, try Android. I mean, that's what I'm going to say. In my opinion, iOS is like much simpler to develop than Android is. And okay, if you have no questions, to sum it up, when you develop an iOS app, you do the design first. So you come up with the design of how your app is going to look like, and you draw it down like how I did, right? You have your inputs and your outputs, and then you concentrate on the functionality. And once the functionality is working, then you can make it pretty looking and make sure that the functionality works before you try and make it look pretty. A question? Cool. And it's all about events and actions. Anything that you do, like a tab or an input, is an event, and you need to tie an action to it. I think that's all I have. I mean, and feel free to ask me questions. I'll be here. And that's pretty much it. Thanks for coming.